All right, we are recording. Sounds good. So let's talk a little bit about East Asia. I'm going to be presenting here. We'll go about maybe 40, maybe 45 minutes, depending on that. And along the way, if you have questions and would like to ask questions, please feel free to do so. You can also simply trying to make sure I'm doing it right. You can also simply just pipe in and ask a question. That is perfectly fine as well. Or we can wait till the end and you can ask questions then if you want to. Okay. So this is a thematic review, like it is a geographic review. It is like where in the world is going on with East Asia. We've done chronological reviews throughout the course of the year as we go through time period 1, 2, 3, and 4. And even though we kind of bounce around a little bit within those places, we're still sort of in that chronological area. So one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted for us to take a look at some specific like regions and areas of the world and kind of track them through time to hopefully help out. One of the things about this class and the way they do the questions, they oftentimes do ask regional or geographic kind of approaches. So they will ask things like, in East Asia, what happened here, or South Asia, or whatever. So, for example, in our practice test that we did, one of the questions is about South and Southeast Asia. So you need to know what those places are. So we're starting off tonight for no good reason with East Asia for our East Asia review. So the first thing we need to take a look at is what the heck is East Asia, right? So if we check this out here, this is this isn't the official one from College Board, but this is basically the official one here for us that you can see. So this is going to be the primary three that we're talking about here is going to be China, obviously. It'll be Korea, and it'll be Japan. Okay. Now, obviously, this is a modern map, so it would also include North and South Korea as a division. We would also include Taiwan, for example. Also Macau and Hong Kong. And then sometimes you'll see Mongolia in there, sometimes not. If you get a question about East Asia, I don't necessarily think you should talk about Mongolia, but I mean, considering that the only place they're really relevant is in unit whatever 2 or whatever when we talk about the Mongols, I don't know that it's necessary. But if they asked like something about the Mongols and it had to do with East Asia, you could definitely use East Asia here. Okay, so again, this is extremely important. If you have a question about East Asia, you need to talk about China, Korea, Japan, etc. If you start talking about, I don't know, Russia or India or something, you're simply not going to get that question right. So make sure you're within the correct geographic area whenever you're answering these questions. All right. Now, with that out of the way, let's take a look at time period 1. So time period 1, again, is units 1 and 2. So we're going to put these together into a sort of rough time period here as we look specifically at the area of East Asia. Now, this is not fully inclusive. Okay. This is not everything you need to know, right? Like there's probably other things in here that we're missing or whatever. So if you're thinking about this and you watch this video or you're here for this video and you say, oh, well, Mr. Osborne didn't mention this, that doesn't mean it's not important or not on the test. This is just a generalized review over some of these things to help jog your ideas, give you a little bit better of a idea for it. We're going to have about 2 slides per time period, some pictures and things like that thrown in as well. So first off, common throughout all of our time periods, 1, 2, 3, and 4, we're going to see some similarities between all those time periods. One of the big ones here is going to be patriarchy. This really only changes a bit when we get to the later periods, like kind of the communists and on. But up until that point, we have a pretty clear patriarchal kind of situation in China. Husband and brother and father, those are going to be the people who are sort of in charge. And part of the reason for that, of course, is Confucian values. They have these values, these ideas of Confucius, and he very much has this sort of like stratified hierarchy that he makes, right? Like the idea is that you have the emperor and then the people, you have the husband and then the wife and so forth. So those things are going to lend themselves to these ideas of patriarchy. One thing that we'll tend to have, again, with the exception of sort of the communists really, is this idea of the scholar gentry, the sort of exalted situation of the scholars, the people who know the Confucian classics. They are given a little bit of land as well. So basically from 1200 in the Qing Dynasty until the end of the Qing, we're also going to see this idea of the scholar gentry, which ties in very well with the exam system. It's not mentioned there at the top, but the exam system basically continues throughout this period as well, except, of course, up until the communists. They kind of break all that stuff. Extended family groups, that is still somewhat true even today in China. This is different than the European family groups. In the European family groups, we have, for example, the nuclear family, mom and dad and the kids or whatever living together. Extended family groups then are going to be things like mom and dad and the kids, but also you're going to have aunts and uncles, or you're going to have grandma, grandpa, all that kind of stuff. Rice cultivation, obviously, throughout these time periods. The two major religions here, in addition to Confucianism, are Taoism and Buddhism. So both of these are going to be particularly important as well. And then lastly, we have this idea of the mandate of heaven. So even up until the nationalists, even through the nationalist time period, there's a little bit of this idea of the mandate of heaven, that when the heavens have withdrawn their power from the king, from the emperor, then that means that king or emperor should not be there anymore. All right, this is going to be a bit political. Like, we're going to go through political eras a bit, though there are also cultural and other kind of economic things. But this era is very easily organizable this way, so that's why we're going to do it. So first off, in 1200, the first dynasty we have here is the Song Dynasty. Okay, the Song Dynasty, 960 until 1279. We are in the period known as the Southern Song when we get here in 1200. So the Song Dynasty used to be a bit larger, but because it was sort of anti-military, oh, there's Malcolm. Because it is sort of anti-military, they don't have a strong military. And so throughout the course of the wars that they fight, they end up being pushed south into this era called the Southern Song. So by 1200, then, they are a smaller area. Oops, sorry about that. They are a smaller area geographically, but they are very powerful culturally. So they have a lot of trade, for example. The Song Dynasty is well known for its new technologies like astronomy or the water clock. Gunpowder, things like that are all super important things that they're going to have. We also got Neo-Confucianism is going to come about in this time period. Remember, the Confucian scholars are facing pressure from the Buddhists. So they're going to modify Confucianism just a little bit to kind of incorporate more like day-to-day kind of things for people. Industrialization and urbanization in this period. Industrialization, not in the sense of like Britain and factories, but they're going to start to kind of like industrialize in a small scale to make it like producing objects and things more quickly. Also in this period, a lot of people are going to be moving into cities. We're going to see people moving off the farms. The cities are going to get bigger and bigger. Now, the Song Dynasty, of course, is conquered by our good friends, the Mongols, and they will found the Yuan Dynasty. Okay, so it is conquered in 1279, and they will have Kublai Khan as the most famous leader. So the initial leader is not going to be Kublai Khan. Genghis Khan never actually conquers the Song Dynasty, though he does conquer some northern territories like the Jin. So I believe this is his son or one of his sons, but eventually his grandson Kublai Khan will be the major one here who will establish this new idea of the Yuan Dynasty. One of the things about this is that it has this thing called Mongol segregation, where Mongols are not allowed really to become a part of the everyday Chinese population, but the Mongols were very admiring of the Chinese culture. On the other hand, though, they are also extremely cosmopolitan. They love things from outside of Mongol world, outside of the Chinese world. It's one of the things that really upsets them, the native Chinese, is that they don't like this idea of cosmopolitanism. Then in 1368, we will have an uprising, the early Ming Dynasty from 1368. The Ming Dynasty is from 1368 until 1644. This is a reaction to the Mongols, right? So they are going to reinstitute the exams. They're going to bring back that scholar gentry. They are going to standardize the language. The emperor is going to live in this place called the Forbidden City. And they are also going to be pretty xenophobic. So weirdly, they are the people who send out Zheng He to explore. But other than that one exception, they really don't like outside kind of influences or anything like that. And that is one thing that they're going to make sure to maintain for quite a period of time. All right, next up. I can't really see the chat here, so if you have questions or whatever, feel free. It's only like 4 of us, so feel free to go ahead and pipe in and ask a question if you have one as we go along, okay? All right, continuing on with time period 1. Next up, we have this is like the general time period here, so we're looking at places outside of China, a couple of other political areas here. So one of these, of course, is the Mongols, which we talked about in context of China and the Yuan Dynasty, but the Mongols, they got that guy Genghis Khan. They're going to conquer most of the world, quote unquote, establish the Yuan Dynasty. They were more than willing to adopt new ideas as needed. They have no problems with that whatsoever. The Pax Mongolica, of course, is the idea of peace of the Mongols, and they will also increase trade during this time. But again, they're not going to be long for the world. The Yuan, when they are overthrown, as well as other parts of it, are going to get rid of the Mongols. Now, 2 other major civilizations here in East Asia, of course, Japan. Japan at this time is coming into its own. It's really only founded about 700 or so, 800 or so. So this is a time period where it starts to develop a little bit of its own ideology, but it's also going to be borrowing a lot from the Chinese. So Confucianism, for example, Buddhism will also come from China. They are going to change it a bit, right? They're going to make it a little bit different. So for Buddhism, for example, they're going to really emphasize the Pure Land tradition. For Confucianism, they're going to have, it's not going to be quite as strong as it is in China. They're also going to have these new shogunates that will take over for the emperors, the Kamakura and Ashikaga shogunates. This is that system whereby you have a military leader who runs everything for the emperor. The emperor basically does nothing but write poetry all day. So around this time period, they will do a lot of trade with China. They have some wealthy merchants. This is the beginning of the samurai class. For the Koreans, then, they are invaded by the Mongols and taken over, but the king is allowed to continue as essentially like a puppet ruler. The king of Korea at this time will be like a tribute state to the Mongols. A couple of things they have that are important here. The Celadon pottery. This is that very light, pale green pottery that's very important. Yangban scholar officials. These are going to be similar to the scholar gentry, but they are going to be a bit more organized. There's a new dynasty that is established in 1400, and that will last until the Japanese invasions about 500 years later. So that one civilization, that one dynasty will last for quite a long time. All right. I really like this. I took this from Freemanpedia, but it's really good. It shows you a lot of the change and stuff as well. A couple of things you're going to see here. You're going to see, of course, the Silk Road moving back and forth, a little bit also of the transfer across the water as well. So we have the initial Southern Song dynasty down here, 960 to 1279. That's the capital at Hangzhou. Then we will have the Yuan dynasty, 1271 to 1368. They will take over control of the entirety of this area. Okay. And then once they are defeated in 1368, the Ming will be in charge here, but they're going to have a smaller environment there. So Beijing or Kanbalik is the capitals of both the Yuan and the Ming. Over here, we can see the Korean Goguryeo Kingdom. We got over here, then we got Japan, the Kamakura Shogunate, and the Ashikaga Shogunate as well. All right. Any questions about time period 1? Can y'all just see the map right now? What can y'all see? Been a while since I've done Google. Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure. Thank you, Ethan. All right, cool. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, let's go then. Maybe. Okay. Next up, time period 2 then, 1450 to 1750. Oh, we got a question here. How did Buddhism transfer to China, and what was China's reaction to it? Good question. This is going to be before our time period. Okay, this is going to be in, gosh, I want to say the 700s or so, 750s. So, of course, Buddhism is going to start down in India with the Buddha, but it's going to be a long time before the Common Era or whatever. And so that's where that location is. But then they are going to have like people, missionaries and others who are going to travel into China. And then they're going to have the basics, the beginnings of Buddhism then. And we'll have a king during the Tang Dynasty who is going to move all of that stuff. He's going to take during the Tang Dynasty, there's a king who wants more Buddhist influence and ideas. So he sends a monk down to India, and he is going to get what's called the Tipitaka, or the three major kind of like writings of Buddhism. This is famously enshrined in a series of kind of folk tales about this monkey who has magic powers and stuff. But that is how that happens. Basically, this monk comes to China with this Tipitaka on the basis of the Tang Dynasty. China initially, like the Confucian scholars, are kind of like whatever, just a bunch of superstitions, but over time they start to be supplanted by the Buddhists. The thing again about Buddhism is that it helps like everyday people, right? Like everyday people have Buddhism, they can say prayers or they can do whatever, right? Confucianism is just sort of what it is, right? So it's not going to help out a whole lot. Eventually, though, when Buddhism starts getting more popular, the Confucians are going to be very upset about it. And then they will do that little modification of Neo-Confucianism to make it a little bit more attractive to sort of everyday kind of people. Confucianism and Taoism would be religions. Yeah, specifically Taoism, because it has a very religious viewpoint to it. We have like the 12, 8 Taoist immortals and, all this kind of stuff. It also has a lot of like Chinese folk traditions in it. Confucianism, sure. I mean, again, the phrase that we use is belief systems. So like, I don't think that they would ask necessarily about religions, but if they did, it would still qualify as a belief system. So it would be qualified as well. Okay, time period 2 then here. Again, keep those questions coming, not a problem. So let's see. Later Ming Dynasty is going to decline due to weak emperors. These eunuchs are going to gain enormous power. Again, these are men who are castrated to work in the government. They don't have families, but they also can gain power on their own. They are going to have a problem with high taxes in the late Ming Dynasty. They eventually will invite the Manchu in as like mercenaries from outside the country, but they are going to help prop up their empire. But they will regret that because the Manchus are going to invade them. During the later Ming Dynasty, we have Zheng He who will sail, but eventually, due to Confucian influence and the death of his emperor, he will stop that. We're going to see some of our first kind of conversions, as well as like a lot of Western influence with the Jesuits who are going to come in. These are the guys who were part of that, part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So we will then see the early Qing or the Manchu dynasty. So the Manchus, again, not surprisingly, are from Manchuria. They will see themselves as separate from the Han. Unlike the Mongols, they don't tend to adopt a lot of like Chinese kind of ideas or Han Chinese kind of ideas. The ethnic Chinese in particular do not like them, especially initially. Now, over time, they get to they like them because they like what they do. But by the end of it, though, again, they're kind of against them again. They really didn't want Chinese or Manchu marriage because they were afraid that they would be subsumed by the Han. Don't forget that men in China, the Han, had to wear the Q, that ponytail haircut where they shaved their head back as a symbol of their deference to the Manchu dynasty. They don't really want a lot of European trade in this period, but that's going to change a bit. So famously, they refused to trade with the British, and of course, that leads to the Opium Wars, everyone's favorite drug-fueled war. All right, a couple of images here for you. That is 1453. And then that is 1648. So you can see a little bit about the difference between the Ming versus the Qing Empire. By the end of the Qing Dynasty, they will control a lot more, but at least initially, they are going to control basically the same area as the Ming with the addition of Manchuria for obvious reasons. All right, continuing on. Japan, then, if we're looking over there, we're going to have our Warring States period known as the Sengoku Jidai, 1467 until 1600. Lots and lots of good Japanese films based around this. The country will fall apart as rivals are going to fight for each other. Eventually, this will be ended. It's not just Tokugawa Ieyasu. There's actually a couple other guys. Oda Nobunaga begins the whole thing, and Hideyoshi Toyotomi will be kind of like the one who unites it a bit. But Tokugawa is the guy who sort of holds the bag at the end of the whole thing. And so he will found the Tokugawa dynasty, and that will last up until the Europeans come. Portuguese will arrive in this period and start selling guns to the warring daimyo as well. All right, so when the Tokugawa shogunate takes over from 1600 until the 19th century, the Tokugawa family runs the country. They will ban foreign influence in almost all trade. So the only place they allow trade is going to be in Nagasaki on this little island. They don't want religion or anything like that. They don't want guns. So no guns or Christianity is kind of the basis there. They will have this strong feudalism. And they will have this thing called alternate attendants. This is a way that the Tokugawa shogun was able to maintain control. You had your like area that you lived in Japan, and then you had to have a house also in Tokyo. So you had to control both parts of those places, which meant that you had to spend a lot of money, which reduced the amount of resources you had. But also this alternate attendance every year, for a year, you had to live there. So you'd live a year in Tokyo, a year back at home, which helped disrupt any plans that they would try to have against the shogun. Korea in this time period, of course, are going to be out from underneath the Mongols, but the Japanese will attack in the 16th century under that guy, Hideyoshi Toyotomi, but they are actually repelled. They are able to stop the Japanese from that invasion. They will follow a similar policy to Japan about not really wanting to trade with Europeans, and they will sort of come back under the control of the Ming and the Qing dynasties as sort of like a tribute state. So they're sort of independent, but they also have a lot of control underneath them. All right. Pop up any questions there if you have them about time period 2 as we move over into time period 3. This is going to be 1750 until 1900. Again, any questions before we bust on into this? Well, I take a sip of water. Hope you all are doing okay out there. Thanks for being here tonight. All right, time period 3. Again, pop them up in there if you have those questions. I'll address them as we go. 1750 to 1900, we got the later Qing Dynasty. So they have a lot of weakness because of lack of technological process. Early in their their period, they were pretty strong. But by 1750 or so, they're way, way behind with military might. They don't have as strong weapons and guns and things like that. There's this thing called the McCartney mission from Britain. So McCartney is this guy who was sent from the British to go to the Qing Dynasty and basically lay out a plan for trade, be like, hey, here's what we're going to offer, here's what we want to do. And he is rebuffed. They say, no, we don't want to do that. We're not going to give you all these rights and stuff like that. So when they are rebuffed, they have no ability to trade with the Chinese. They decide to force the Chinese to trade, even if they don't want to. So that is going to lead to the importation of opium. And as a result of that, that will lead to the Opium Wars in the 1840s. And China is going to be forcibly open to trade with Europeans. This program will be called Spheres of Influence. Each of the Europeans will have a little slice, a little chunk of territory. The part for the British is called the Canton system, after the city of Canton, where the British were headquartered out of. Another thing that's going to happen here in the late part of this time period, around the 1850s or so, of course, is our friends in the Taiping Rebellion will break out. And it basically is only put down due to the help of Europeans. So as a result of that, then the Chinese and the Qing Dynasty are even more in debt to Europe. They don't have the ability to control their own borders. So the British and others are the ones who are having to do that. We will have the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, which is going to have more control by the Japanese. And then eventually the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. So we're just seeing this repeated situation where the Chinese are unable to police their own borders. And in return for that, then we are going to have people coming in to police the borders for them, and they're going to lose even more and more control over their borders and over their territory. And so by 1911, then we will see the overthrow of the Qing Dynasty because of people's unhappiness related to the control of the Europeans and others. And so that will lead to the nationalist period, which we'll get to in time period 4. Yeah, Taiping Rebellion is in response to two things, really. One is a little bit about like European control, but the bigger factor for the Taiping was that they hated the Manchus. So Huang Shiquan specifically said that in his visions, he had been told by God, his father or whatever, that the Manchus were literal demons on Earth that were there to control them. So it's kind of a response to poor leadership by the Qing in a sense. Like the Qing are not doing a very good job, which means that the Taiping are the ones who want to try to revolt and rise up. It also has a little bit to do with ethnic repression. The Han Dynasty, as well as the Qing and the Han, sort of repressed different minorities. In this case, the Hakka minority is the one that is there. But there's also a lot of little kind of underlying things too, because they are going to, like, there's a lot of Christian influence coming in at this time. There's a lot of other chaos and stuff. And so that only helps breed, cause a breeding ground essentially for the Taiping Rebellion. Yeah, Parker, good question. The Boxer Rebellion. So there's this group called the Society of the Harmonious Fist, I think is what the name translates to. So that's why we call them boxers, which is fun. So basically throughout Chinese history, we have these examples of these sort of like dojos, I guess you'd say in Japanese, these like exercise gyms that have sort of not only physical kind of things, but also political or cultural things as well. So one example, like these go back a very, very long time period. So like if you think about like Kung Fu, it's supposed to not only develop your body, but also your mind and stuff, right? So the Society for Harmonious Fist was opening up a whole bunch of these little like kind of gyms or whatever where people could do this, but they also brought along a sort of traditional Chinese belief. They believed that they had powers and stuff, but they also really hated foreigners. That was their big political movement that they had. So they were like kind of a military group. This doesn't really translate well to like European or like Western kind of ideas. This doesn't exist, but it would be sort of like if a CrossFit gym like all of a sudden like had a political party or something like that. That would be an example. Hey, Kate, will you mute your camera for me? Makes it go a little faster. And also I'm going to put this on the internet. I don't know if your pictures are going to be up there or not, but you know, we'll check it out. So what were we saying? Yeah. So the Boxer Rebellion. Yeah. So that is an example of anti like foreigner kind of situation is what it is. So they're going to be this sort of military group as well. Oh, you know, making a connection. Time period 4, we talked about Falun Gong in a few of our classes. It's very similar to what Falun Gong is. Falun Gong was that kind of like Tai Chi sort of oriented kind of thing that was in China, but it got kicked out and it's become sort of a political movement as well. So yeah. All right, hopefully that helps out a bit. The thing about the Boxer Rebellion, though, is that they revolt. They try to assault the Europeans in Beijing, and so the British and others have to bring in military troops to help suppress the Boxer Rebellion. And then once that happens, then that's only even worse for the Chinese as far as who's in control of their country, because now the Europeans are like, yeah, we're just going to run things now because you can't even control these Boxers either. All right. If you're just joining us, feel free to type in questions over there into the chat, or if you really want to just ask a question, you can hit the little raise hand button or whatever. That'll work as well. All right, so here's just some images for you to kind of get an idea of what we're talking about here. We got the Qing Empire over there on the left at its greatest extent. Looks pretty similar to modern day China with a little bit of exception there. On the bottom right, then you'll see some of the rebellions that are taking place. Now, look, there's a ton of them. The big one there, though, on the bottom right is the Taiping Rebellion that you can see. But there's also this Northwest Muslim Rebellion. There's the Panthay Rebellion. You can also see a whole bunch of British attacks on them. Basically, the Qing Dynasty is just kind of falling apart like as we go along. All right, time period 3 continued here. Let's look at Japan and Korea real quick. So Japan is very much kind of held back by the by the leader, by the emperor of Japan. So in 1853, Matthew Perry, who's the American Commodore, will open up trade. Basically, again, the United States is looking for trade opportunities, but we were a little late to the imperialism situation. So we don't get anybody there until quite a while. And so by 1853, then when we're looking around, we're like, well, everybody has control. Like we can't really trade with China because the British control it or the French control it, et cetera. But there are these islands, right off the coast of China that we can maybe work with. So what we do is we send this guy there. He is going to basically open up trade forcefully and cause the Japanese to sign the Treaty of Kanagawa. Now, what happens then is that because of this, people realize just how bad they have it in Japan. They're like, wow, we are so far behind. We are 200 years behind. We've got swords. These guys got cannons. And so they will have this thing called the Meiji Restoration, which will cause the Tokugawa to fall. So the initial idea is that the emperor is going to be in charge, but that rapidly changes to oligarchs. So these are non-hereditary people who have a lot of money or power. Again, it's different from, say, the samurai leadership because, again, they're not hereditary. It's not like people are related to each other or they are given their power purely due to hereditary reasons. These guys instead are there specifically because they have a lot of power and money. That will lead to a rapid industrialization. Like we're talking from like swords to giant cannons and tanks and stuff like that really, very, very quickly. This increased militarism leads to the invasion of Korea in a war with China by 1900. In 1905, they fight a battle of Tsushima against the Russians, which establishes them as a world power because they're able to defeat the Russians. And that is seen as like a big matter because they are not Europeans. Korea is going to suffer under the hands of the Japanese with this invasion by the Japanese in the late 19th century. I think it's like 1895 or something. They will try to destroy, they will basically try to destroy the Korean independence and culture. So they will do things like force Koreans to take Japanese names. They will destroy historical and cultural sites, things like that. And the Koreans will be controlled by the Japanese until after World War II when they will get their independence. And of course, that will lead to North and South Korea. Okay. Who's got questions on period 3 there with Japan, China, all those kind of good places? Pause for just a second, see if you got any questions. Thanks for coming out tonight. Don't forget, on Thursday, we'll do another one of these on Africa, though we're going to do it a little bit earlier. I'm just trying to kind of bounce these around a bit so that people who have different times can do different things. I think I have it for like 5:30 to 6:30 maybe. All right. Well, don't hesitate to put a couple questions in there. Let's talk about time period 4 then. All right. Looking at China again in our first slide. In China, there will be an overthrow of the Qing Dynasty in 1911, as we already talked about, and that will lead to the introduction of the Republic, or what is known as the nationalist government. Okay. Important leaders here are Sun Yat-sen. He is actually held in veneration by both the communists and the nationalists. They both sort of claim him. He, again, is a little bit vague on what he wants. He's got these things called the Three People's Principles, but they're real kind of generic. Like what he basically just wants is a country that is unified and organized. He's a Chinese nationalist, right? And if that means that, he has to work a bit with some communists or something, I mean, whatever, so be it. But he is going to die a little bit early, and then his mantle will be passed over over to Chiang Kai-shek, who is also known as Jiang Jieshi. This guy, on the other hand, is not as big of a fan of the communists. He doesn't really want them in their group. And so that will cause some problems between the two of them. These nationalists then are very disorganized. They're corrupt. They're prone to warlordism. The problem here really is that there's no central authority. There's no like one person who's able to unite everybody together. So when the Qing Dynasty falls, there's a whole bunch of little military units in like various provinces or territories. And so these guys end up becoming warlords essentially. One of them actually during the nationalist period tries to establish a brand new empire, basically, like names himself the emperor. I think his name is Yuan Shikai. He tries to name himself emperor and is promptly put down. People are like, yeah, we're not doing that again. But these warlords then don't necessarily want to work together, which causes problems. They're stealing from people, all this. So it's very difficult for them to organize themselves. Initially, again, these nationalists will work with the communists, but they are going to have a falling out, primarily because the communists were, well, for two reasons, really. One is that the nationalists tended to be a little bit more towards the capitalist groups or whatever. But the other is that the communists were also trying to undermine them and take control. Like, remember, in the long run, communism believes that they should take control of the world, right? Like it's going to conquer the world. So while Mao Zedong was willing to work with the nationalists while it was in his advantage, as soon as it wasn't, he was starting to kind of push against them and try to like take over control of this. So when they have this falling out, then the nationalists will attack them. They are fairly successful at defeating the kind of nascent communists. And so these communists then are forced on something called a long march as they try to escape from the nationalist forces. And that will nearly end the communists. They start with a lot of people. They end up with very few, but they will end up finding some refuge in North China, where the power of the nationalists was not very high. They are mostly headquartered in the south. You will see maps of like China in this period that just say nationalists all over it. But remember, that's not really true. They have a lot of power in certain regions, and they're pretty weak in others. So around this time then, World War II breaks out. 1937 or so. And so the nationalists are going to be allies with the United States, of course. Japan will take territory and will commit a number of atrocities throughout China. One of these, of course, the most famous of which is the rape of Nanking, where I think it's like 300,000 people are killed in brutal ways, beheadings and things. There's some indication of chemical warfare and medical experiments. It's very much like Germany, except that we kind of covered it up a little bit because the Japanese are our allies after World War II. After World War II, the communists will fight and win in the 1949 in the Chinese Civil War. Primary reason the communists are able to win is that they're just a lot more organized. They have a kind of ethos in a sense, I guess, like they have a concept that is communism, so that makes them a little bit more attractive. They're also not as bad about corruption and stuff like that, so that means that they are able to defeat the nationalists. The nationalists then will flee to Taiwan, which is what it is today, a renegade or rogue province. That is what the PRC believes it is, but it has essentially its own government, its own leaders, and all that kind of stuff. So after they take control, then the communists will rule the country, and Mao Zedong will work very heavily with the Soviet Union. But part of the problem with working with the Soviet Union is that they are sort of under the Soviet Union's shadow. And so when Stalin dies in particular, Mao wants to get out from under the Soviet domination. And so he comes up with this fantastic idea called the Great Leap Forward, where the country ends up not producing enough grain and causing starvation, etc. As a result of that, then a lot of little criticisms start coming out. And so Mao says, you know what, you guys are not sufficiently communist. So we're going to go ahead and have a cultural revolution instead. He will again call for the country to purify the party by getting rid of all these old-fashioned people and making the whole country a whole lot better. The process, of course, will devolve into like wild stuff. Nobody goes to schools. There's lots of fighting and things like that breaking out across the country. And it essentially kind of delays the country for a couple of years. Now, it never technically ends. Like they don't like declare it done. But this occurs sort of in the like late 60s, early 70s. And so by the end of that time period, then he will die in 1977. His wife and a couple others called the Gang of Four will kind of decide that they want to continue the Cultural Revolution, but everybody else is like, nah, let's not do that. So Deng Xiaoping will take over, and that will lead them towards some market-based reforms. The idea is that they will be communist, but they will allow a little bit of market reforms to make things a little bit better in China. That, of course, today has led them to essentially be a non-communist country, even though they call themselves that. So the modern day China, of course, has a centralized government, but they have some like kind of a mixture of sort of communist central authority kind of stuff, but also a lot of market reforms as well. Who's got some questions about China then at the end? Pop them up there. See a couple maps here, like I just said. Ethan. I mean, according to the People's Republic of China, it's a rogue province, right? Remember, the United States doesn't take a position on it. We're like, it exists. And they're like, if you're like, what is it? You're like, well, it exists. That's what we know. It is a country, or it is a place, The United States has guaranteed its independence, at least at the moment. So we'll see how that goes in the long run. But yeah, over on the left, you will see Republic of China. But again, don't forget, that's kind of iffy. They don't necessarily control every bit of that. You see that line in the middle there? That's the river that moves over. South of that, they're very strong. Maybe just to the north of it as well. But once you get up like into Manchuria or especially out west and stuff, they're just a lot weaker. So that's why they're not able to control those areas quite as well. Also, you can see they don't control Tibet. That's something that happens after that in I think it's like 53. The People's Republic of China invades Tibet and takes over control of it. All right, over on the right, then you will see World War II, essentially, over China. So you can see Japanese lands in 1931. You can see that they occupied Korea, for example, there, right in the middle. Then you can see in 31 to 33, they will seize control of Manchuria or Manchukuo. Then they will declare war in 37. So from 37 to 38, they will take control of the northern part there around Beijing, a little bit of the south as well. And they will eventually, during World War II and stuff, they will take even more territory from there. Here, of course, is the People's Republic of China. You can see Tibet is conquered by them in the 53 or so. This is the time period when the Dalai Lama flees and makes his way down to India. That has been a controversial situation ever since. Yeah, so Ethan, what happens is, so Ethan's question is Manchukuo a Japanese name for Manchuria? So what happens is the Japanese will take control of Manchuria, and what they want to do is they want to create, they have total control of it, but they want to call it like a puppet state. They want to be like, oh no, Manchuria is proud to be independent, and they're just allied with Japan, right? So what they do is they take the last Qing emperor, whose name is Henry Puyi, who they capture, and they put him in charge as the emperor of Manchukuo. Okay, that's their new name for this country of Manchukuo, but nobody buys it. Like nobody actually thinks it's a country or anything. It's basically just the puppet state that Japan creates to give themselves a little bit of, I don't know what you call it, a little bit of legitimacy, I guess. Over there on the left again, you can see People's Republic of China, and then on the right we can see Mao Zedong, very important figure there as well. All right, Q1, good question. How much influence did the USSR have on China at its peak? Okay, remember, at the very beginning of the independence of the People's Republic of China, they are BFFs forever. The Soviets are going to send a lot of like equipment and military stuff and all that to the People's Republic of China. They are trying to give it a lot of assistance to do things. And again, Mao really likes Stalin a whole lot. So once Stalin dies, that starts to break off a little bit. They're still going to be influential with each other, but it'll start to break off a little bit over time. The biggest change then occurs in the 1960s. The two sides really start disagreeing with each other. Mao doesn't like the new Russian leadership, and so they will actually fight a couple of border skirmishes. If you look at that map that's up there, over to the left, like just past Mongolia, you see that little lake there. Down over in that region was where there were some border skirmishes. The two sides had some military troops that sort of shot at each other. Nothing really came of it, but it was a example of how much they had fallen out from each other. So it was one of those things, like when you think about the world at the time, you maybe when we talk about the Cold War, we talk about the USSR and communism, and the United States and non-communists or whatever. Well, the People's Republic of China was communist, and they were on the side of the USSR, but not fully on the side of the USSR, right? Like if they had interests that would differ from them, they were happy to do it. They had a number of different states that they were more affiliated with. So, for example, like Vietnam was a pro-Russian communist country, whereas Cambodia was a pro-China. Albania, for some reason, was pro-China. I don't really understand that, but different countries were different like levels of commitment to China or to Russia during that period. And then in the 1970s, very early 1970s, Nixon will go to China and recognize China as the People's Republic of China in an attempt to sort of split them away from the USSR. And so that's going to really be the low point of their relationship, is when the when the United States recognizes China and sort of helps to pull that kind of thing away from each other. So at its height, like in 51, 52, it's probably pretty strong, but eventually it's going to start declining basically after that. All right, Parker, what is the main religion in the states below China, like Vietnam and Thailand? Yeah, Buddhism is the big one there, okay? So if you look south of there, you will see Burma, okay, like on the map that you see there. If you go to the west towards India, where it says South Asia, that area is going to, of course, be Muslim or Hindu. So you got Bangladesh. Is that, what color is that? I don't know. What is that, blue or pink or something? That is right there next to Burma. That is, of course, going to be Islamic, as well as Hindu or Islamic in South Asia. Now, as you go to the east or to the right of that map, though, the majority religion in those areas of Southeast Asia is going to be Buddhist. Now, way back in units in time period 1200 to 1450, we'll have a bunch of like territories like Majapahit or Srivijaya. Those places are going to be a little bit Hindu. So that's why in Cambodia, we have things like Angkor Wat, which was a Hindu temple. But that eventually will be supplanted by Buddhism or Islam coming through that region. So throughout Burma, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, they are going to be predominantly Buddhist or like atheists, basically. Like, Vietnam doesn't really have an official religion, but they do have a lot of Buddhists there. As you go south, then, like where it says Malaya, you go into Malaysia or you go into Indonesia, that is going to be predominantly Islamic. So, like, basically, what's going on here is that the boats and so forth are traveling from South Asia down towards Malaya, right? And that is how the religion of Islam is getting down there, but it's traveling more slowly across Southeast Asia through places like Burma, Thailand, etc. Okay, so again, much like in China, Japan, etc., Buddhism is going to be the big one there. The one difference, though, here, and this maybe is getting into the weeds a bit too much, is that China, Japan, South Korea, North Korea, well, South Korea, they are going to be Mahayana Buddhists, like the large raft, the big group of Buddhists. These are Buddhists that tend to be a bit more almost like religious Buddhists, whereas in Southeast Asia, it tends to be more Theravada, so more like monastery kind of Buddhists and stuff, more like individualized. So Thailand, for example, is a home of something called the Thai forest tradition, where like instead of like going to help people and being nice and stuff, you just like wander off in the forest and like meditate for 20 years or whatever. That's more of the kind of like Buddhism that you have within Southeast Asia. All right, good questions. All right, let's bump down to the last one. Again, anytime you got questions, though, chime in, please. All right, time period 4 then, 1900 to present. Let's look at Japan and Korea. Japan, of course, is an ally in World War I. I don't know if you knew that, actually, but again, in World War II, not our friends. An ally in World War I, but they're very unhappy at their treatment in the Paris Peace Conference. They basically roll up to the Paris Peace Conference looking for some territory, and everyone's like, you're not really that European, sorry. So they're going to build up their military and launch the Pacific part of World War II. I don't know why part is capitalized. Apologies. They will defeat and attack. They are defeated and attacked with nuclear weapons, of course, at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, post-war, they are rebuilt by the USA as essentially a bulwark against communism. That is going to be that guy, Douglas MacArthur, will essentially become the dictator of Japan for about 5 years. And after that period, they are given independence after we help them sort of establish a new constitution that we like, that works really well for us. They will eventually develop, of course, a successful economy based around high-end manufacturing, which we see today. So lots of things like electronics and stuff like that are what they tend to make. A lot of that has been offshore to places like China nowadays, but they still kind of design and make a lot of that stuff as well. So kind of high-end stuff is what you would mostly see there. When I did a trip there, we went to a nuclear fission factory or something. They made parts for nuclear fission stuff. It was huge. Korea, on the other hand, invaded by the Russians at the end of World War II. They are split into, of course, North and South. The North invades the South, and then in 1950, this is all the Kim family and their sort of hereditary communist dictatorship. That 3-year war of the Korean War ends in a stalemate. We basically push them back across the original line. And since then, North Korea has become this hereditary communist dictatorship and has really steadily declined over the long run, right? So North Korea has famines and stuff all the time. They pump all their money into the military to help keep themselves safe, and it's pretty bad. Ethan asks, is there a long-term resentment towards the U.S. and Japan? Not necessarily. In general, it was okay. Like part of this process in like both Germany and Japan was sort of like the denazification policy. They're basically trying to get rid of all the people who would have supported these things. Also, I think because we let them keep the emperor, that was a big factor. And I think a lot of people did realize the problem. Unlike in Germany, though, where there is like no remnant of this, there is a little bit in Japan of these very far right wing dudes, right? Like you'll see these guys, they're a very small percentage, 1 or 2% or whatever, but they think that Japan needs to rearm and like attack and do all these things again. So there's a little bit of that kind of stuff going on. Traditionally, though, there has also been a little bit of resistance to American military bases and stuff. So we have a military base in Okinawa, for example, and throughout the 1980s and 90s, there was all these problems. Like stuff happened all the time. Like American soldiers would go out in like a Humvee and like accidentally run somebody over or something. I don't know why this happened all the time, but I swear to you, like about every 2 or 3 years this happened. And so the Okinawans in particular got really mad about it, and that caused a lot of like people in Japan to be upset. But again, the thing about it though, for Japan in general though, is that they are, they and South Korea essentially are these two countries during the Cold War that are the only non-communist countries in that region, in that area. So difficult for them to really totally resent America because we are essentially part of their lifeline. Like they know that if they repudiate us, then they're just going to become in China's sphere of influence instead. So yeah, I mean, you'll find some Japanese who don't like us, but I think you'll find the same anywhere in the world probably. So nothing specific though for that. All right. South Korea, on the other hand, of course, has become a democratic and market success over time. They initially were not democratic, but by the late 1980s, they end up changing their government into a more democratic system. Also, huge market success, lots of cars, all these kind of things. They export a lot of culture also, and I should say, and economic resources as well. So don't forget, obviously, K-pop, as well as some other stuff as well, is going to be exported around the world from our good friends in South Korea. All right. That is gonna be it right there. Awesome. All right. So who has any additional questions they would like to ask about East Asia? I'll tell you what, we had 1 or 2 people join us kind of right afterwards, though. Let's go back a little just to make sure we understand. We had a little bit of a problem with this, but I want to make sure we understand East Asia. So let me just put that up there. If you've already seen it, just hang on for a second. Yeah, so just real quick for those of you who joined us a little bit late, that is East Asia. Okay, so this was a little bit of a problem on our South Asia questions. People were talking about China, not the correct answer. So make sure you know what is East Asia when you're answering questions. China, South Korea, Japan, those are our big ones. But technically Mongolia, maybe Taiwan, Macau, or Hong Kong would also be examples of that area. Okay, so make sure we know what East Asia is. All right. What other questions we got? Anybody else want to ask any other last minute questions here? No. Generally speaking, if it asks a question about Southeast Asia, it would not be. You could talk about the influence of China in Southeast Asia. Like they have a lot of influence on Vietnam in particular. Like they fight a bunch of wars with Vietnam over the years. So you could talk about that maybe all the way back to like Dai Viet, like in the very, very early days. But generally speaking, if the question is like, what is the cultural aspects of Southeast Asia? You want to talk about like, Vietnam or Thailand or whatever on its own, but you could, depending on what the question is asking, you could bring in things like there's a little bit of Confucian influence in Vietnam. You could talk a little bit about like Buddhism doesn't quite spread from China to Vietnam or to Southeast Asia, but a little bit of that as well. So you could talk a little bit about it. But again, if you start talking about China, if like the question is like, what is the political situation in Southeast Asia or whatever, and you start talking about, Chinese communists in the 19th century or 20th century or whatever, that's not what you want to do. You want to talk about Vietnam or Indonesia or something like that instead. That's the best way to answer that question. Yeah, great question. The Philippines is a little bit in kind of everywhere, is really the answer to that question. The Philippines is kind of a weird one, right? Like it has Spanish influence, it has the United States influence. When we've had control of it, it has a Muslim South, but it has a Christian North, basically. So it's kind of a weird circumstance. I would probably put it within South Asia. So that would be the best example of that. But really, the only time you would really see anything with this, like Philippines just doesn't come up a lot in our topic. The only time it really comes up is when it comes to what's the name of that thing? The propaganda movement, like in like unit period 3, like 1800s or whatever, like the Spanish American War for imperialism, or the propaganda movement trying to get independence, things like that would really be the time period for that. And I just don't see it coming up too much. I don't think it would be qualified for East Asia though. Mongolia be Central or East Asia? I think it probably works better for East Asia just because of its connections there. But again, if it's if it's period 1 question, you could probably talk about it. You don't typically see a lot of Central Asia questions. You're just not going to see that a lot. And if it does say Central Asia, you definitely probably want to talk about the Mongols if it's in that time period. But like if it's like Mongols and it's like unit 4, like 1900 to the present, it's just not really something that's going to matter to that question. All right. Let's see. What influenced the Sino-Soviet War? Ishan, that answer is really just kind of a question about weird, like communist politics, basically. Like the two sides had a disagreement over communism of some sort, and that just made themselves upset. You basically have like it's like two children on the playground. You know, you got the guys in Moscow who are in charge. You got Mao and in Beijing, who's not that stable really either, and they are just disagreeing with each other, and that's really what leads to it. That's the best answer I can give you. There's nothing else really specific otherwise that I know of. At least nothing that would like matter for the test, really. All right. Is there a certain period for Asia that will be more likely to be questions about it on the exam? No, I mean, I don't know about a period, but some topics that would that potentially come up. Like a lot of that stuff about like the late 19th century. So all that stuff about the Qing Dynasty and the imperialism and all that, that tends to come up a fair amount. Remember, we don't do a lot of unit 1 on the test. So you're just not going to see a ton on like I mean, like you should not spend your time probably a lot of time on studying like the Ming or something. It's just not very likely to come up very often. But the Mongols potentially will come up for sure, and also the sort of post-Mongols time period. You know, like the Qing Dynasty also as well would come up a bit. So, how did Japan consolidate power in the last period? I don't know what you mean by consolidate power. You mean like how do they get power in the last period? If you mean that, it's purely economics, really, right? So like Japan does not have much of a military, sort of. They have this thing called the self-defense force, which is pretty powerful, but it's not designed to expand. So like Japan was essentially like hamstrung. They have handcuffs on, right? That says you cannot do military stuff. So they're like, okay, we can't do military stuff. What can we do instead to kind of like raise power and stuff? Well, we can use our economic might. So they do that a lot. They'll do things like they do soft power things like send money to like poor people around the world or whatever, or they build a lot of economic and trade goods, like, you know, with other places around the world. Doing things like that is really how they're going to consolidate their power, is through like using their economics and other stuff to really sort of benefit themselves and benefit others. But again, it's because they don't have to worry about their military. Like the United States basically has them covered, and they have their own little military as well. Cool. Anything else? Or we'll go ahead and end it just a couple minutes early here. Ishan. That is something we'll have to talk about in class, maybe. Hey, listen, I would tell you, just recently, this is not just y'all. What's his name? Heimler just released a video like yesterday on SBMCQs. It's like 5 minutes long, and he basically walks you through doing some of them. So that's it. I say every time that people ask me this question, I just say practice, practice, practice. I mean, just do a bunch of them. Really is the best thing to do. Just get used to them in general. I don't know how you did necessarily, but a lot of people did pretty well, just all things considered. So I think some of that practice has helped out. But yeah, I mean, just practice. Like the two things you need to know is like you need to know the information and you need to know how to do a SBMCQ, and that's really all I could tell you a lot of times. No, my gosh, Ben, I don't know. Unit 3. I'm just kidding. No, I mean, time period wise, you should study like I would say time period wise, I would look at time period 3. So that's the 1750 to 1900. There's a lot of material there. They like to ask questions about the Industrial Revolution, stuff like that. So I would think about that time period is probably the most important. Again, you need to think about like they don't like extremes, right? Like they don't want to do first unit, they don't want to do the last unit, right? Like time periods 2 and 3 are really where the money is. You know, that's where the thing is. So like the answer, Ben, is like you should study it all, right? I mean, obviously you should spend time on it, but if we're triaging, if we're trying to choose what part of the material to study, you should probably start with time period 2 and time period 3. That's the place to start with. And then if you get down to it and you have more time to study the rest, that would be good as well. Q1, good question. I don't know, 40 plus maybe. You know, like if you're getting a 40, 43 or something and shooting for a 5, that'd be good. 5s really come more from getting a lot of the extra points on the written portions though. Like you see a lot more 5s coming from things like getting all your points, or 8 or 9 points on the SAQ, or getting like 4 to 5 points on the LEQ and stuff like that. Like that's going to be a big way to do it. But if you're 40 plus, you're probably cruising for a 4 or 5 from there. All right, cool. Well, hey guys, I'm going to go ahead and end it here. Thank y'all so much for being here tonight. Again, we'll do this again on. We're doing the next one on Africa on Thursday. Then we'll do another one on Sunday. So come on down if you can. I'm going to toss this up on the internet. Yeah, Ben, thanks. I appreciate it. I just have this thing, man. I can't get rid of it. This is like my third like sinus thing. I need to go to the doctor, but I gotta do 2.5 weeks and get y'all ready for this exam, and then I'm going to go to the doctor over the summer, I think, to see how I can do. Yeah, he's actually here. Do you want me to bring him in real quick? Say hello to him. Kate, yeah. Okay, all right, one sec. Big baby. It's a big baby. Hey, you want to say something? They don't really fit him.